You may be seated. Good evening, distinguished guests. It's my honor to welcome all colleagues, members of the academic community, locally and internationally, friends and family, to the inaugural lecture of Professor Jonathan Okeke. I would especially like to acknowledge the presence of our Vice Chancellor and Principal, Professor Francis Peterson, and the head of the Department of Philosophy, Professor Emma Roetkamp-Bloem. Before we move on to Professor Okeke's address, I will say a few words about our Vice Chancellor. Today marks the one-year anniversary of Prof. Peterson taking on the role of UP's Vice Chancellor and Principal. Congratulations. Prof. Peterson has brought to UP a wealth of experience in the higher education sector. He previously held positions as the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of Free State and Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Cape Town. He regularly speaks at prominent international conferences, contributing to the global discourse on higher education and research. He's also the chairperson of the Board of Directors of Universities South Africa. We at UP are indeed fortunate to have our institution steered by a visionary leader who prizes not only academic excellence, but also the thoughtful care of those who deliver it. So best wishes on your anniversary, Prof. We look forward to many more years of working with you. And so this inaugural lecture marks an important milestone in Professor Okeke's distinguished career. It provides a valuable opportunity for us to engage with his scholarship, celebrate his contributions to philosophy, and reflect on the impact of his work within our faculty, on the university, and beyond. I will hand over now to Prof. Peterson to do the formal introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dean, and for that kind introduction. It's wonderful to stand here and knowing that I have survived 1 year. But nevertheless, it's great to be Vice Chancellor at the University of Pretoria. And one of the things that make it great is also inaugural lectures. And it's great and fantastic to be able to introduce Professor Okeke a little bit later. But I also would like to say good evening to all of you, all of the guests that's here, as well as our University of Pretoria colleagues. It's fantastic to welcome you at this inaugural lecture. I would also like to acknowledge the family and the friends of Professor Okeke, who is joining us this evening. His wife, Dr. Amara Chimakonam, and it's great to see also the 2 children that's here. Don't know how much they're going to understand what you're going to be telling us this evening, but nevertheless, they are also here. His kinsman, Professor Jonathan Okongwo, Professor Francis Nawanwu, and Ichanako Ogorchi, and Mrs. Ichioma Ogorchi, that's here this evening, and his teacher, Professor Joseph Agbo, from the Mboyi State University in Nigeria. It is also a great honor and a distinct privilege to welcome you all to this landmark occasion, the inaugural lecture of Professor Jonathan Okeke. And he will talk a little bit about the title of his talk a little bit later, which is what I've read, going to be very exciting. So the inaugural lecture is one of the most cherished traditions in the life of a university. It marks not only the culmination of years of dedicated scholarship, but also a moment of reflection and dialogue with the broader society. Just before this meeting, there was about 4 students, quite high achievers from University of Pretoria, different faculties, that just wanted to have a conversation with me. And they were just keeping on asking questions. And I said, well, I'm going to be late for this inaugural lecture. And they said, but what is an inaugural lecture? So I was explaining to them the value of the inaugural lecture. But tonight we gather not only to celebrate the achievements of an eminent scholar, but also to reaffirm the university's commitment to the pursuit of knowledge that transforms lives and shapes communities. This evening's lecture addresses a question that lies at the very heart of Africa's journey. What has been described as the African predicament. For decades, this challenge has engaged the minds of scholars, of policymakers, and also as leaders. Despite political independence and abundant resources, both human and capital, or natural, the continent continues to face profound political, social, and economic difficulties. Some people would call it the resource curse to a certain extent. There's a lot of writers that refer to that terminology. But Professor Okeke challenges us to look beyond familiar explanations that attribute to these difficulties solely to external forces or internal governance failures. Drawing on ancient African history and also on logic and philosophy, he interrogates why such challenges persist to persistently, even decades after independence. By introducing and theorizing concepts such as colonialism and communalism, he reveals underlying ideological commitments that continue to constrain Africa's path to modernization. His work is a bold call to rethink the foundations of communal contract and to imagine a new ideological framework capable of enabling Africa to chart its own course. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is now my honor to introduce to you our distinguished speaker. Professor Jonathan Okeke is a renowned philosopher and logician currently serving at the University of Pretoria. He hails from Oba, Idemili South in Anambra State, Nigeria. He earned his bachelor's degree from Ebonyi State University and his master's and doctoral degrees with specialization in modern and mathematical logic from University of Calabar. He has been a research fellow at various institutions in Europe and Africa. His teaching and research interests include logic, African philosophy, ethics, political philosophy, philosophy of the mind, race studies, and decolonial thinking. He is an author, a co-author, and co-editor of more than 140 research works in books, articles, and chapters. Professor Okeke has delivered several invited lectures and keynote talks at universities around the world. He has been interviewed by many academic blogs and media outlets. His theories and concepts have been themes of international conferences and also international panels. His works have inspired several rejoinders, reviews, and also theses. His ideas are part of various universities' curricula and philosophy modules, and in 2021, his intellectual biography was written and submitted as a master's dissertation in the Department of History at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He is a mentor to many African academics and has supervised several master's and doctoral theses. He propounded the theory of esumezu logic and developed the method of conversational thinking, and is a major proponent of conversational philosophy and several other concepts and principles in the fields. Professor Okeke has past and ongoing research collaborations with colleagues in many universities. He has received funding from national and international organizations, such as the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences, the National Research Foundation, or the NRF, the John Templeton Foundation, and many others. Professor Okeke is a second-generation member of the prestigious Caliber School of Philosophy and the president of the Conversational Society of Philosophy. Colleagues, distinguished guests, family and friends of Professor Okeke, tonight we are privileged to listen to one of Africa's philosophers whose work breaches the world of logic, history, and lived experience, and whose scholarship continues to inspire new generations of African thinkers. And it's now my honor, on behalf of the university, to invite Professor Jonathan Okeke to deliver his inaugural lecture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice-Chancellor, for those kind words. I was quite elated as you introduced me. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, Professor Francis Peterson, the Dean, Professor Kevin Thomas, Deputy Deans, I can see Professor Pikirai and Professor Zita, my head of department, Professor Emma Rutkamblom, distinguished guests, friends, students, family. Welcome to my inaugural lecture. Thank you very much for showing up to listen to me. I will address you tonight on the topic of the communal contract and the real African predicament, colonialysis, communalysis, and the danger of the post-community. And I'd like to begin with a short anecdote. On December 8, 2024, a Zimbabwean mixed martial artist fighter by the name Themba Gorimbo lost by submission to a Brazilian opponent. It was not his first loss. As a matter of fact, he lost his debut fight in February of 2023, which cast a foul mood on his family and friends. But he went on to become the first Zimbabwean UFC fighter to win a UFC fight in May of the same year. He went on to win all of his fights thereafter. And there were lots of joy at home in Zimbabwe. In these successes, people celebrated, his friends and family in Zimbabwe. This victory by an unknown Zimbabwean fighter was a collective victory of his people. And soon after, many pundits began to tout that this man was going to be the next big superstar, which suddenly changed everything. Themba Gorimbo was no longer that unrenowned shell that projected his community's image. He had become a powerful, strong individual, better than everyone from his community, which suddenly changed everything. In African communities where people revel in coming together to only when there is a need to fight a common enemy or threat. Nothing is more tabooed than someone becoming self-sufficient, becoming so powerful, different, and better than everyone else in his community. And this was what happened to Themba Gorimbo. Envy, jealousy started emerging. People started sending insane financial requests And when Gorimbo could not fulfill all of them, they became incensed. They became angry, disgruntled, and accused him of looking down on them. And when he tried all he could to help, not many people were happy. Most people were never satisfied with whatever Themba Gorimbo did from then onwards. He even built a water well for his community. And many still criticized him for not siting the water well in front of their own houses. And so, things started changing for Themba Gorimbo. Many of his people started wishing for his downfall, and their chance came on UFC Fight Night 310 when he lost. And there was fanfare in his community. Local newspapers caricatured his loss with uncharitable news caption. Someone even sent a video of some of his family, relatives, and friends celebrating his loss. Gorimbo was shattered. Not because of the silly party, but because he knew its significance. It marked his excommunication from the family, his ostracization from the community. So many of us Africans here can relate to that. There is no punishment, no fate that is worse than being excommunicated from family. And this was the fate of Themba Gorimbo. And to make matters worse, Themba Gorimbo continued to receive these messages from those that he loved, celebrating his loss, telling him that he would never rise beyond where he was. And so, my friends, this became the antecedent psychological condition that inspired what I plan to articulate in this talk as the real African predicament. Mind you, that the reason for this sort of mindset was the nature and structure of the African communal values. It was structured to imbue its members with the mentality to come together to fight, but not so much as to come together to create wealth, build enterprises, develop their communities and their societies, and move it forward. And this was the mindset that, And so, in this atmosphere, which is exactly what continues to occur and reoccur in Africa that we know today. Themba Gorimbo had his experience, but that is also the experience that many of us share on a daily basis. And so, in framing the problem of the real African predicament, which is the focus of my lecture today, I define it as a disequilibrium existing in the psychographics and the psychodynamics of a society that trifles its need for collective creation in favor of the need for collective destruction. Now, these needs are informed, fueled by two types of mentalities, which I conceptualize as the negative solidarity mentality and the positive solidarity mentality. The former is about the tendency, the psychological tendency to come together, to fight a common threat or enemy. The other is a psychological tendency to come together to build, to create, develop, and advance a society. And so these two mentalities were unreconciled in traditional ancient Africa, as I discovered in my research, studying the archives and archaeological pieces of evidence available. They were unreconciled. And because of these two unreconciled mentalities formed the main basis for the derailment of African communities into what I frame as the post-community. Now, the post-community is a key concept in the theory that I am trying to weave, and I am going to explain it as I progress with the talk, alongside the historical and socio-psychological circumstances that inform the nature of the real African predicament. Okay, but before I do that, let me unpack the African predicament itself as it appears in the literature. And so there are many theorists in the subject of African predicament, but I cannot highlight all of them. So let me focus on three people I consider to have, given the most robust contribution, made the most robust contribution on the problem. And they are Frantz Fanon, Stanislaw Andrejewski, and Ali Mazuri. Now, beginning with Frantz Fanon, in his book of 1952, titled Black Skin, White Mask, Frantz Fanon deployed the psychoanalytical tools in studying the African colonial history, as well as African colonial experience and identitarian problems, and came to the conclusion that the main problem of the newly independent African states would be what he calls the dependency complex. And according to him, this dependency complex was informed by the inferiority mentality, inferiority complex in Africans. And then he criticizes M. Manunai, engages with him, who had arrived at a similar conclusion before him, but who had argued that the inferiority complex was naturally ingrained in the African. Fanon said no, and criticizes Manunai for lacking proper knowledge of colonial history, and goes ahead to state in that work, quote, that the only type of experience that has the scale to cause the inferiority complex in the African was the colonial experience, end of quote. And then he goes ahead to say again that, quote, that the feeling of inferiority in the African is correlative to the feeling of superiority in the European. And then let us have the courage to say it outright. It is the racist who creates his own inferior, end of quote. Now, by this, Fanon was actually trying to lay the blame for African predicament at the feet of colonial actors. And that makes him an externalist in the African predicament debate. And then we progress to Stanislaw Andrejewski, who published a book in 1968 titled African Predicament. And in that book, he defines African predicament as the obstacles facing the new African states on their path to elementary freedom, to peace and stability, as well as prosperity, end of quote. And then in the various chapters of that book, Stanislaw Andrejewski began to identify and discuss some of these obstacles that he identified as constituting the African predicament. One of them was population growth. He says that the steady population growth in Africa was responsible for overwhelming Africa's economic capacity. He also identifies totalitarianism, which he says stifles freedom necessary for building robust economies. And then he also identifies the dysfunctional education system, which according to him lacks the capacity to build, to train and produce the high-level technical skills required to build a modern society, industrial society. And then he also identifies in lack of industrial society, which according to him slows progress, and so on and so forth. Now, Andrejewski lays the blame for African predicament at the feet of Africans. Inept leadership, corrupt leadership was also one of those that he identified. He lays the blame at the feet of African actors, and that makes him an internalist in the debate. And then finally, Ali Mazuri, a reputed Africanist scholar who gave a series of lectures in a BBC program in the 70s, which eventually brought together and published as a book in 1980 titled The African Condition, a socio-political diagnosis. In that book, Ali Mazuri articulates the African predicament in a 6 paradox, one of which was that Africa was the oldest continent, but the very last to become truly habitable as a result of Western hegemony and imperialisms. Another one was that Africa is farthest from the West, but is the continent becoming rapidly westernized more than every other continent. The next one was that Africa is one of the most naturally endowed continents, but the one that is poorest of all the continents, and so on and so forth. And so he goes ahead to articulate a 7-point agenda strategy for resolving the African predicament, which includes increased military capacity that involves African nations acquiring nuclear weapons so that they would be able to counter the Western hegemony. He also talks about increasing the progress of modernization, slowing down the rapid progress of westernization, and so on and so forth. Now, Alimas even predicted that in the future, Nigeria, South Africa, Congo, when they come under proper indigenous democratic leadership, will lead the African Renaissance. That prediction has yet to happen, even though the conditions he set for it have all been met. In any case, there have been many critiques and commentators who have engaged with the works of these scholars and other theorists in the field, so I will not dwell so much on that. But what is important for me to mention is what I think they all share together, and which connects very well with the theory that I am weaving, and that is that all of them tended to overlook the historical and socio-psychological, ideological circumstances of ancient Africa in analyzing the problem of African predicament. In other words, they tended to focus almost exclusively on the colonial history and post-colonial history. Now, history is a very important subject, but unfortunately, many scholars always tend to ignore history when they undertake very important researches, and which is what I believe that they have done in ignoring not only some portions of history important for their analysis, but the most important part of the history. And this is probably why the renowned physicist Stephen Hawking says, and I quote, that the greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. And so, Mr. Vice Chancellor, it is safe to say that Hawking's illusion of knowledge was a crucial factor in the misdiagnosis of African predicament. And this was also because the thinkers who worked in this field were influenced by various predilections. The Africans amongst them were definitely influenced by some sort of cultural egoism, something that the inimitable Innocent Assos of the Calabar School would describe as, quote, the tension-laden human ambivalent existential situations and unintended ethnocentric commitments that becloud the judgments of people and make them look down and overlook things that matter in the pieces that they require to conduct their research. The Westerners amongst them were also influenced, perhaps largely by the pejorating colonial narrative propagated by some racist scholars, such as the likes of the excessively biased Hugh Trevor Roper, for example, who in his book of 1965, titled The Rise of Christian Europe, sponsored the spurious narrative that African history began with European colonization. All right? And this man actually went on in a 1969 essay to use the uncharitable term unhistoric to describe Africa, which is not so different from some of the diatribes we have seen in the literature. For example, the one promoted by the German philosopher George Hegel, who in his book, Lectures on the Philosophy of World History, wrote one of the most demeaning excerpts about Africa. In fact, in his word, and I quote, Africa proper has no historical interest of its own, for we find its inhabitants living in barbarism and savagery in a land which has not furnished them with any integral ingredient of culture. It is a land of childhood, far removed from the light of self-conscious history and wrapped in the dark mantle of night. End of quote. Now you wonder, a human being, a philosopher for that matter, that can produce such a terrible, terrible description of a people, even when the person knows that it was all false. But that, again, highlights, tells us so much about the impact of biased influence in scholarship. When scholars are biased, influenced, they are subjective, they are not objective, that's the kind of things we see. Now, both Hegel as well as Hugh Trevor Roper have all been criticized by enlightened scholars and peers, so it's not worth dwelling so much on that. But perhaps it's important to mention that in the 1992 very interesting paper published by Finn Figostad, he, trying to criticize Hugh Trevor Roper himself, said, and I quote, that the avalanche of articles and books published in African history, including multi-volume histories in general world history, published from the 1960s, bear testimony to the absurdity of Hugh Trevor Roper's position, end of quote. And so, this reminds us as academics and scholars, whichever field we are, to take history seriously, but also to take certain standards and traditions of research very seriously. Because if the outcome of our research does not deceive a few people, it could actually miseducate generations, as we have seen in history itself. For example, excuse me. For example, one very unique incident that occurred in the 18th century involving King George II of England, of Great Britain. You know, this man made a lot of money from slave labor and slavery. As a matter of fact, he was the governor of the South Sea Company that was responsible for ferrying millions of captive Africans across the Atlantic. He was also a prominent shareholder in the Royal African Company that made a lot of money from slave labor and slavery. And so along with his fellow oligarchs in Europe, they were determined to keep the system of slavery active. And when critics started challenging them from the religion, people like preachers like Methodist preachers like John Wesley, Anglican preachers like Thomas Clarkson, Pentecostal preachers like Anthony Benezet, the Quakers, whose ideas eventually led to the anti-abolition movement of 1870s. And even academics and intellectuals of the period started criticizing and campaigning that slavery must end. What did they do? They went to a great length to ensure that they find a scientific basis to justify slavery. And this man, as soon as he was coronated king in 1733, and the very first thing he did was to establish a university in 1734, and that is the University of Göttingen in Germany. Of course, the electorate of Hanover was also under the British rulers at that time. And what did they do there? They headhunted academics in Europe who were sympathetic to slavery and gathered them there, tasked them, funded them to generate a scientific theory that could justify slavery. Amongst them, those they gathered there included Johann Blumenbach. They were anatomists, historians, philosophers, and the rest of them. Carolus Linnaeus was there, John Hunter, John Zimmermann, Mesger, Krugel, Meiners, and the rest of them. And Ottfried Karl Müller was also there. And there was this circle that they all put together from their different departments. They call it the Göttingen School of History, where they shared ideas in pursuing this diabolical project. And then Karl Ottfried Müller himself, to be specific, took it upon himself to dethrone the Asian model of history and enthrone what they call the Aryan model of history. The Aryan model of history, they sought to demonstrate that the European civilization traces its roots to Europe and not to Africa or to Middle East, as the Asian model of history demonstrated in long historical records that traces down to Herodotus and down to the modern times, supported by archaeological excavations and discoveries. What did this man do? Because he was a trained philologist and a self-styled historian and archaeologist, and there's an accepted position in philology, that some of the oldest languages in Europe were the Indo-European languages. And these include the Germanic, the Italic, the Celtic, the Indo-Iranian, the Armenian, the Balto-Slavic, the Tocharian, the Anatolian. These are the Indo-European languages. And this man thought that if these languages were the oldest languages in Europe, then there must have been a great civilization amongst them. And that civilization must have had a great army that invaded westwards, conquered the Greek islands, and colonized them from where the European civilization arose. This was false. False. Everyone knew it. Their sponsors in political powers in Europe knew it. But they, nonetheless, integrated it in curriculum of education in Europe, and then it spread throughout the world. Falsehood replacing truth. And he did this in his, I'll give you a reference, in his book of 1820 titled The History of Greek Peoples and Cities. He claimed in that book that this inversion was unreported in ancient history. So where did he find it? And all that. But this is the mindset. And this, is a demonstration of what biased influence in scholarship could actually do in distorting global history. And so, Mr. Vice Chancellor, this reminds us to always remember to respect the philosophic standards, to respect the standards of the academia, to be objective, to raise questions, to be balanced, not to be subjective, and above all, to be presuppositionless when we carry out any sort of inquiry that we carry out. And this, again, re-echoes the golden words of the British philosopher Bertrand Russell, who in a book of 1912 titled The Problems of Philosophy said, and I quote, that a man who has no tincture of philosophy goes through life imprisoned by the prejudices derived from common sense, from the habitual belief of his age or nation, and from the convictions which have grown up in his mind without the cooperation or consent of his deliberate reason. To such a man, the world tends to be definite, finite, obvious. Common objects rouse no questions, and unfamiliar possibilities are contemptuously rejected. It is when we lack this type of philosophic mindset and go into conducting research that we dabble into some of the errors that distort global history and miseducate people, if not generations. And so, Mr. Vice Chancellor, I do not think that by a tincture of philosophy that Russell was talking about a degree in philosophy, or even the highest degree in philosophy. I believe that by a tincture of philosophy, Russell was talking about that cognitive responsibility and stability, that undisrupted, uninterrupted focus with which a researcher should, carry out his research from an unprejudiced perspective. And so I do not believe that the theorists in African predicament, those I discussed and those that I have not mentioned, did their due diligence in this regard to ensure that their predictions and their outcomes are actually accurate. And this can be seen in the type of conclusions they reached. The Africans amongst them tended to be Afrocentric, and Europeans amongst them tended to be Eurocentric. Besides Fanon, who drew attention to the psychological roots of African predicament, all of them, including those that I did not discuss, tried to articulate African predicament as a social, political, or economic problem. But if African predicament were to be a social, economic, or political problem merely, why has that problem persisted? Why has the problems that Africa, why have they persisted and continue to become even more complicated decades after political independence? Why has the system of democratic rule, for example, not been able to fix the problem, despite the awareness of the problem, the freedom of self-governance, and the abundance of natural and human resources that we've had on this continent? Why? So these questions scaffold my investigation and proposal of the real African predicament. So I use the adjective real to distinguish my formulation from their formulations, because I believe that we are eminently in error in what they articulated, having not considered all the pieces that were necessary to be considered in their research. And so, Mr. Vice Chancellor, one is compelled at this juncture to ask, in accordance with my opinion, that if all that's been put out there does not pass muster as African predicament, what then is African predicament? Or to put it more concisely, what then is the real African predicament? Now, I have articulated the real African predicament as I conceived it earlier, as a disequilibrium existing in the psychographics and psychodynamics of a given society that rifles its need for collective creation in favor of the need for collective destruction. These needs reflect the two mentalities I mentioned earlier, and they are both important whenever there's this collectivist structure. But then, the equilibrium is important, and in a situation where one continues to go up and the other continues to go down, such a society will hardly make progress nor survive, depending on which one. Okay? Excuse me. And so, in the context of this work by psychographics, I mean the average pattern of thinking of population in a given society, all right? And by psychodynamics, I mean the variations that exist in that pattern. So the disequilibrium that I mentioned was actually occasioned, but what I framed as the communal contract. By communal contract, I mean the unwritten agreement that ancient African peoples had that enabled them to set up the ancient African communities and all that. So now, without understanding the circumstances that led to the formation of the ancient African communities, it is difficult to understand why the nature of that community and the impact and influence that that type of community and its ideological tenets, have had on Africa from then on to the modern time. And to unpack all of this, I'll have to tap into the theory of social evolutionism, which is a theory in sociology that accounts for how human societies progress from the isolated food hunter-gatherer stage to modern state. And I use it to divide Africa's social progression into 6. The first one being the age of innocence, followed by the age of corruption, the age of community, the post-community, the monarchies, and the modern state. By the age of innocence, I mean that state in ancient Africa where people, disparate individuals, live at great distances, frolicked, and had very minimal needs of food, security, and what have you. But importantly, they had not developed the senses of some basic emotions like greed, envy, jealousy. They had not reached the awareness of the range of the freedom and power that they had, and they also had not attained the consciousness of the ownership, for example. And so, in this was an age of innocence. But then, as populations started to grow and clusters started forming around families and villages, at some point, they must have reached this consciousness. But again, still lacking the awareness and consciousness of law and order. And we can imagine, therefore, in such a setting where people now know the range of unrestricted freedom that they have and the sort of power that they have, but without the idea of law and order. We can imagine the sort of situation there. There must be carnage, bloodbaths, murder, killings, and what have you. If anybody needed anything, you just had to walk up to the person who had it and take it by force. And if the person would not let it go, then he would do whatever he pleases to that. It's no moral qualm. Nobody holds anybody responsible. Okay? Now, this becomes the age of corruption. And, of course, political thinkers in Western thought like Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau have also articulated this as the state of nature. Okay, so now, but we can also imagine and infer from there that at some point in that society, a line must have emerged, separating the strong minority from the weak majority. And the strong minority are unlikely to prefer antagonizing themselves because of the danger it portends for them. So the weak minority must naturally have become the common prey for all of them. And so, but at some point, because this weak majority are human beings and they have possessed reason, they must have at some point reached the awareness that their numerical advantage, could be tapped into to, enable them band together to check the excesses of these strong individuals, or even destroy them when the need arises. And at some point, as that type of consciousness develops, they must have come to a point where they had to sit together, articulate a few tenets, a few norms, which becomes the emergence of the first African communities. Now, it is important to know that at the emergence of every collective structure, there are two types of mentalities that naturally follow. In my research, I try to articulate them as the positive solidarity mentality and the negative solidarity mentality, which I have defined much earlier. Now, the type of mentality that characterizes a particular such a structure depends on the circumstances that instigated or inspires the emergence of that community. And in the African situation, as I have described in the age of corruption, it was circumstances that, created a lot of carnage and destruction that must have created a lot of distrust, trauma, and fear and anxiety eventually. But then, human beings being very adaptable and rational entities must have, as they continue to live together, realize the wonderful things, the benefits, the great things that they could accomplish if they work together rather than only coming to fight together. And this must have been a time when the wonderful ideas such as Ubuntu, Ukama, Ujama, Umunna started to, form, all right? But in considering historical archives and archaeological records, I came to the conclusion that there was a strong, a powerful factor, a disruptive factor in Africa's social progression, and it happened at this stage, which left these wonderful collectivist ideas to remain at an embryonic stage, all right, derailing most of those communities into the post-community. Now, I distinguish post-community from the normal communities. In the normal communities, the weak majority who started it, who formed it, must have selected amongst themselves men and women of probity and accountability to administer the norms that they have given to themselves, to regulate the behaviors of members of the community, but ultimately to check the excesses of strong individuals. Now, in the post-community, when the disruption occurred, the post-community became a place where the strong individuals who had reinvented themselves from the braggadocios that they were in the age of corruption to polished politicians, and hijacked through a careful subterfuge the community structure, such that instead of the men and women of probity and accountability filling the leadership roles in the community, it was now the strong individuals who were filling these roles. And the majority, the populace, still remains ignorant of must have remained ignorant of what had occurred. And these post-community wardens were using the instruments of manipulation, deceit, confusion, and all kinds of things to control people, suppress them, and repress them for their own benefit. How did I arrive at this conclusion? Because by the 12th, 14th, and 15th century AD, when Europeans arrived in Africa, historical archives shows that the majority of places in Africa were still at the community level of existence. There were quite a number of them that continued on a firm path of social progression, reached city-state, reached monarchies and empires, if you like, but they were few in number compared to the great majority that lagged behind and remained stuck in the age of community. But then, the community where they were stuck in was not the normal community, because according to social evolutionism, they would have naturally, organically progressed if they were in that type of community. So they must have been stuck in a different type of community. And that was why the hermeneutical exercise I conducted gave me the outcome that the strong individuals must have hijacked that community. And in today's African communities, we can see how the leaders of those communities manipulate, deceive. Then that gives us an idea that these modern leaders of African communities, whether they are chiefs or presidents or lawmakers or judges or security officials and what have you, that these modern people were the modern avatars of the ancient wardens of the post community, deceiving, manipulating the people for their own benefit and their own benefit alone. And so again, social evolutionism tells us how societies progress. But one thing it doesn't tell us is the role of individuals in occasioning that type of progression. And so I came up with the idea of social consciousness. Before a community can progress from one stage to another, the members of that community must have attained a certain type of social consciousness to build that new stage of community. And that is what I characterize with negative solidarity mentality. Positive solidarity mentality, sorry. So the negative solidarity mentality enables communities to protect their union, because it is the tendency to come together to fight any perceived enemy or threat. But it is the positive solidarity mentality that drives progress, that enables them to work together, to build, to create enterprises and progress their community. And so, Mr. Vice Chancellor, I understand how controversial this could be, but I am happy to defend it. And I make bold to claim that in all of Africa, south of the Sahara, without an exception, there does not yet exist a modern state. All that we have are post-communities. Modern state is not just a factor of constitutions. No matter how wonderful that constitution is, South Africa has one of the most liberal constitutions in the world, and yet it is still the crime capital of the world. Modern state is not just a factor of constitutions, of law and order, of democracy, of skyscrapers and what have you. They are a part of it, but the most important element in it is the consciousness of the majority of its members. Have they attained the requisite threshold of positive solidarity mentality in their social consciousness? Because that, for me, the higher that consciousness goes, the better, the more sophisticated the society you can build. And so by the time Europeans arrived, the second disruptive factor in Africa's social progression occurred. That is the European civilizational contamination of Africa. And Africans could no longer organically develop on their own the social consciousness and move up to the modern state structure on their own. Now the Europeans, by the time they were living, had constructed a modern structure and left it in the hands of Africans to manage. And it's also important to know that the Africans who took over from the Europeans were not daft. Many of them were highly educated and all that. Yet, decades down the line, one fact remains, cannot be disputed. They could not manage the state structure, the modern state structure that was handed over to them. They could not even sustain it, let alone advance it. Despite the education, everywhere in Africa, from one state to the other, state institutions are being handed over to foreign governments and foreign corporations. The resources of many countries in Africa are not being tapped and managed by those African countries, but by foreign corporations, foreign governments, and what have you. Over there in Zambia, you know what has happened to their copper. In South Africa, here, elsewhere in the world, it is the same from Sierra Leone to South Sudan, from South Africa to Senegal, from Cote d'Ivoire to the Congo, from Nigeria to Liberia. It is the same thing, because the positive solidarity mentality needs to come to a certain level, threshold, in order to sustain and manage modern forms of life and exist in a society. It is only Africans who will not be able to work together when they don't like each other. If an African is an enemy to another African, they won't be able to work together. And that system, both of them are in, will collapse. And of course, we know human beings being what they are, it is difficult to come to a system where everyone agrees and love each other. And that is why they can't work together to create. And so, to wrap it up, for those who still think that my proposal is outlandish or too controversial, I'd like to leave you with a few more ideas to ponder over, some sort of LCM so that you can fill up whatever you want under it. All right? What I want to do is to highlight what I consider to be prominent characteristics of the post community, so that you judge for yourself whether you are living in a modern state or in a post community. All right? The very first one is failure of citizenship. Okay? Failure of citizenship. Now, citizenship has many components, but I'm going to mention just two that connects with the theory that I am weaving. The first one is the legal component. With the legal component, states confer citizenship with full rights and privileges to those who have been made citizens. But then, these cannot work without the second component that I want to mention, and that is the nationalist spirit, with which a citizen requires to be able to fulfill his or her duties as a citizen in that particular state. Now, when the majority of people in a state lack the nationalist spirit, what do they have? Local mindsets. Local mindset. And local mindset is a very dangerous thing in a formal state polity. It's a very dangerous thing. Why? Because in every local, there are several locals. So if your local is race, okay, there are multiple locals within race. If it is culture, if it's language, if it's geography, if it is even economic status, there are several locals. And the edges and contours of these locals represent frontiers of war and conflict. And in all of these conflicts and war, the local will always win, and the national will always lose. And so, Mr. Vice Chancellor, no nation whose majority of whose citizens are imbued with local mindset can ever rise above mediocrity. There might be some signs of progress, but when you consider everything together, you discover that all that is there is regression and not progress. For example, when a state that has 30 million population and a 40% industrial capacity, then when the population turns to 60 million and that capacity has increased to 50%, it might look like progress. But when you consider the proportion of the population and the industrial capacity, then you discover that that state has been regressing all along and not making any progress. And that is the story of every state in Africa south of the Sahara. Number two, crisis of thought. Crisis of thought is when the pattern of thinking of majority of people in a state does not align with their actions. The way they think does not align with the way they act. It is crisis of thought. But then in some fora, you may have that where people, of course, the law is there to checkmate corrupt people and those who want to violate it. People who want to weaponize that, take it as a strategy to advance themselves, make profit, cheat others, but they know that they're doing the wrong thing. They know that that's not how the system is supposed to function. That is not what I mean by crisis of thought. A situation, a state where there is crisis of thought is when the majority do that without knowing that it is wrong. They think that that is the way things work. That is the way. How often do you hear, this is how things work here? And in such a state, there cannot be progress. Now, to give you an example, people in such a state might clamor for merit, but they cannot tolerate merit. They may cry for excellence, but they cannot tolerate excellence. All right? 10 out of 10 times, they will choose mediocrity over excellence. They will choose mediocrity over merit. Crisis of thought. 10 out of 10 times. When low self-esteem and lack of confidence creates timidity, they call it humility. When stable self-concept and boldness creates confidence, they call it arrogance or pride. Because those things remind them, advertise the emptiness within them. The things that they see such people, they see things they will want to be that, but things they will never be. And all that. Because in a state, in a post-community, where there is crisis of thought, people do not, from childhood, struggle to imbibe the positive and wonderful values. They struggle to imbibe only those values that can enable them survive and thrive in the post-community. And so by the time they arrive and someone who has been trained well emerges with these sterling values, it blinds them and they give it the opposite name. In a post-community where there is crisis of thought, negative behaviors are rewarded, while positive ones are punished. And that is the story of every African state south of the Sahara. Number 3, colonialisis. The brilliant Nigerian thinker, Emefiele Zane, published an interesting book in 2014 where he coined the concept of colonialisis and defines it as the disease of the colonized. He goes further to say, quote, that it is the unconscious mental state in which a person strives to reject everything about his culture and language, while at the same time struggling to imbibe and embrace everything that is colonized from the colonizer, end of quote. It is a mental disease, and amongst those afflicted by the disease were Africans of the colonial era, the post-colonial era, and even in these days, there are still many people living with this disease and destroying institutions that they are charged to man or where they are supposed to function, even as ordinary citizens everywhere. And so, crisis of thought, colonialism becomes another important characteristic of the post-community. The German anthropologist John Helgebrock, a third African state some time ago in the 1990s, and he couldn't believe what he saw. In fact, in an essay he wrote in early 2001 to be precise, he said, and I quote, that indeed arriving Africa for the first time, one is met with a disappointment or even a certain shock. You're looking for Africa and you don't find anything but Western lifestyles in their worst forms. And on the other hand, terrible poverty and social disintegration, end of quote. This man, before he ended that trip, he met with the Beninois philosopher Pauline Hotonji. And the very first question he posed to Hotonji was, where is Africa? To which Hotonji spontaneously and gleefully replied, in our hearts. Helgebrock was more confused than he was before he posed that question. But of course, Hotonji does not know the answer. He didn't know the answer. But he understood the question and understood the problem. Okay? It is a problem that continues to haunt us. And something that Frantz Fanon describes as colonized intellectuals. And the Belgian philosopher Placide Tempels, in his now notorious book, Bantu Philosophy, captured with the concept of evoluers. Colin King used the concept of deracines to capture it. And this refers to Africans who, in a bid to become civilized, abandoned and shed off everything that makes them African, and struggles to imbibe everything Western. And at the end of the day, in that intellectual evolution, they are stuck in the middle, no longer Africans and no longer Westerners. So everything they do it wrongly. When they want to apply the law, they apply it wrongly. They want to make policy, they make it wrongly. Whatever they want to do, they do it in a very wrong way. If, for example, there's an economic problem, what do? They don't think to see what caused this problem, the circumstances they might have engendered this problem. What they do is they turn the pages of textbook, looking for when that type of economic problem occurred in the West. So if, for example, they found out that America had this terrible recession in the 1920s, and they compare it to the one they are having and say they are similar, they look for the solution that America employed in the 1920s and implement it in Africa of 2020, without considering whether the people in America are the same with people in Africa, the circumstances of life in these two epochs. They don't even care to know that the world has moved on and changed. And this is what even the elites do. Because education for them was not about understanding, it was always about imitation. It was always about copying. It was always about trying to kind of imitate what is there in the text and not to understand the fundamental principles of it and be able to think for oneself. And so, this is also why I wrote somewhere that the most devastating effect of colonialism does not consist in its economic exploitation or its political suppression, because economic losses, it consists in the disfigurement of the African mind, because economic losses can be regained, political losses can be reclaimed. But mental losses, how do you begin to mend a broken mind? The easy way is not possible, the hard way is not even feasible, because mental losses are simply incalculable and sometimes irrecoverable. And so, number 4, communalysis, as I be to wrap up. I coined the concept of communalysis to express the opposite phenomena that is an Christian's colonialysis. And who are those who are afflicted by communalysis? They are members of the young generation in Africa. Now, studying and seeing what has happened over the decades since political independence and blaming their fathers, they even feel a certain form of embarrassment and shame as to how colonialists damaged their fathers and their grandfathers. They start this, revolt against everything Western. They blame Western imperialism, Western ideologies, and everything. That is why I conceive communalysis as a trauma-induced obsession that compels a victim to take a mental flight back to an imagined African communal fortress, from the safety of which they can rebel and collectively fight off oppressive ideologies and ideologues as common enemies. So you see the opposite of communalysis working here. You see a factor of what has also characterized the Gorimbo community that I mentioned, something that Asuzu captures in his maxim, super maxim, stated as follows: the nearer, the better, the safer. That those who are closest to me, most related to me, are the best people to relate with. They are the best people to associate with. They are people who protect my interests more and all that. And this refers us to the several locales within locales that I mentioned in the very first characteristic, the failure of citizenship. And so from here, I get to the next one as I be to wrap up. I call it the predominance of timiopolitics, of timio power. All right? By timiopolitics, I mean the politics of terror and fear. That this is the exact same strategy that the wardens of the ancient African community employed in the ancient African post community. It's that same strategy they employed to manipulate, to control, using the norms, to punish and terrorize those who do not align. And then those who are the onlookers become afraid and try to fall in line, as the case may be. So that is also what happens in modern-day post-community, where the presidents, the lawmakers, the judges, the law, who are not under the law as the common people, use the same law and the categories of terror and fear to control people. Now, people protest when they want them to protest. They fight when they want them to fight. They point at the person they have to go and destroy using negative solidarity when they want and whom they want. Just as the wardens of the ancient African community did to men and women of probity and accountability. In that community, people were still being destroyed as strong individuals, but not the real strong individuals, but the men and women of probity and accountability, who now challenge them and criticize them and stand in their way. That is what their modern-day avatar also do in different African states. If you know an exception, please, I'm happy to hear. Okay, so since you don't know an exception, let me go to the last characteristic. I call it the problem of foolish majority. In 1989, an American essayist by the name Francis Fukuyama, published an interesting essay he titled The End of History. In that essay, he predicted that the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union will mark the end of socialism as a political option. By 1992, Soviet Union had collapsed. He developed that essay into a full-length book titled The End of History and the Last Man, and he eulogized democracy as the last man standing. As at that time, there were about 3 nations that were democratic around the world. He predicted that most nations eventually will become democratic. There's no other, this is the end of history. Democracy is the last man standing. And he used this very famous cliche to describe it, that eventually all wagons will pull into town. And by the millennium years, his prediction was coming to fruition. Some 130 nations had become democratic, even though eventually a democratic decline set in, as reported by Huntington and the rest of them. However, the point I want to make with this problem, factor is this. In democracy as a political, economic, social ideology rise on the crest of majoritarian principle. What in a state or states in Africa where you have foolish majority, what type of leadership do you think that such majority will produce? And how do you think those leadership will be able to manage the affairs of those states? And where do you think they will drive those states to? And this is not just about the national or regional government or local government, but organizations and groups and whatever, private and public in society. If a society has foolish majority, logically, whatever circle, whether not government or private or public, whatever group will again automatically be dominated by foolish majority. The decision makers will be dominated by foolish majority. What type of society? What type of progress? And so when you cry, when we wail, when will Africa emerge out of this quagmire? Let us also remember that it doesn't look like we are going to emerge from this quagmire if every circle of decision-making is dominated by foolish majority, because that's what we have. Aristotle says that every state deserves its leadership. And Plato, in his Statesman, writes, and I quote, that democracy is the worst form of all lawful governments and the best form of all lawless ones. It is the government of the mob. You know, in this modern time, it's been polished as a wonderful thing and the best type of government there could be. It is good, and it delivers, and it works. It has this wonderful, it's very difficult to mention any type of government that can perform better than democracy, truth be said. But then democracy will work better in societies and states with wise majority, because its fundamental principle, one of them, and the most important of his principles, is the majoritarian principle. The decisions, policies, laws are made by the majority. And if you have foolish majority, democracy becomes the greatest enemy of such a state. And so, as I wrap up, you might wonder, what is my solution to this problem of real African predicament that I have articulated, implicated in the concept of post-community, the concept of negative solidarity mentality, the concept of the positive solidarity mentality, and the concept of the communal contract. What is my solution to this problem? I am articulating my solution in a book form, and that book is over 80% completed now. But it is not a book where you have democracy as a kind of ideology that would drive it. Of course, from what I've said so far, it is very easy to discern that democracy will be the first tool thrown out of the box. Because there's no way Africa's foolish majority will wise up under democracy. It is impossible. And that is why Africa became worse off, things continue to get worse in Africa decade after decade. And so I am articulating a totally new ideology, not socialism. It couldn't even win a simple war with democracy, but a brand new ideology, one that I articulate considering every pieces, in my estimation, that needs to be considered. And I urge you to look out for that book and read it. So, before I wrap up, let me thank people that are important, that have played important roles in my career and continue to play roles in my career, beginning with my family, my late parents. To begin with, my father wanted me to be a lawyer, and my mother wanted me to be an academic. I didn't want to be a lawyer, and I didn't want to be an academic. I thought both of them were lousy. But their pressure was really too much, so eventually I succumbed. I was going to be an academic, but an academic philosopher, not a lawyer, and not a physicist, as my mother wanted me to be. But I thank them for the groundwork they laid, and the discipline and the training of discipline that they gave me. I have found some of those values, the most important in my life. So I thank them wherever they are. I'm sure they must be proud and happy. I also thank my dear wife, Dr. Mara Chimakonam, who has really been a rock, steadied the ship. And she's also a philosopher, so we really usually have a lot of arguments, a lot of discussions, and a lot of debates, which have benefited us, in our careers so much. I can't thank her enough. And my two little children who have grown used to the cliche that is working, that before they come to my table, they first ask, "Daddy, are you working?" I hope that one day I'll be able to walk out of this career I never wanted in the first place and have more time with them. And so I also thank my colleagues in my department. I can see John Sani there. I can see Dr. Shivasi, as well as Professor Matolino, and some other colleagues. I can also see my HOD, Professor Ima Rutkamp-Bloom. I can't thank you enough, actually. You came out strongly in this to make sure that this works well and gave me every support that I needed. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And to my friends, really, in the faculty and colleagues, I can't thank you enough. I can see it there, Professor Fiki Rai, as well as students, my students, former students, and friends from other universities. I can see the contingent from UNISA. Thank you very much. I'm happy to see all of you. And I thank the deanery and our dean. The leadership you have provided have really settled me and made me very happy. Thank you. And our vice chancellor, thank you very much. It's interesting. You're celebrating your 1-year anniversary in the university today, and I am marking it with a lecture in your honor. Thank you very much. And there are many people to thank. My friends from the union. I'm a member of the union, by the way. I can also see Anthony there and some other colleagues in the union. My honor students, I can see them line up there. Thank you very much. Moleke, Melo, my PhD students, and even Jack, my wonderful and efficient teaching assistant. Thank you very much, Jan. I see all of you. Thank you. And finally, who have I missed? I can see my kinsmen, of course, Professor Jonathan Okonkwo and Professor Francis Wongo. I can see Professor Ihan Nacho and his lovely wife, Ijama. Thank you for showing up. I can see Professor Ongu here, Gilbert Ongu. Thank you immensely. I appreciate this support. And finally, my professor from Ebonyi State University, who taught me for 4 years in my undergraduate program, Joseph Nemekabu. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation and being here today. You don't know how happy you make me. When you look at him, he may not look, he used to be handsome, more handsome than this, He was much younger then, and, but in my mind, when I look at him, I see a shining African prince. This man inspired me so much in the classroom, outside of the classroom. Outside of the classroom, I've never known any teacher who carried himself with the level of confidence with which he carries himself. He's so self-assured. And that inspired me a lot. He made me to study this man. I tried to study this man, to understand this man. Inside the classroom, he inspired me to believe that I could achieve anything greater than myself. And every day I looked forward to his classes. And when the class was about to end, I wish he could extend for another hour. This man represents everything you would want in a teacher, the best of them. He is so disciplined. He shows up every day. He never missed a class. He never turned up late. Even the day he was sick, he still showed up. He didn't tell us he was sick, but we could see the man was very sick and was staggering in the class. But he still showed up, demonstrating his dedication to his duty, his dedication to his students. He is more than a man in my estimation. And his life is a lesson to me. And when I receive anonymous student surveys, and some of them use the language, "You inspired us," I think of him, because he was the one that inspired me, that enabled me to inspire my students. And I cannot thank him enough. In fact, very recently, an honor student of mine who had graduated wrote me an email. And in that email, she said, and I quote, "Prof, I thank you so much for all that you have done for us. I have never received any training quite like the one you have given to us. Thank you, Prof." And so I can only borrow those words from that my honor student to thank you again here, sir. I thank you so much for what you have done for me, for us. And I in my days as a student, and I have had very good teachers, really, from my primary to the doctoral level. Wonderful teachers who contributed immensely to making me who I am today. And I cannot thank them enough, because they contributed in making who. But this man stands out of many. He stands out. And so I use those same words by my student to tell you that I never received any training quite like the one you gave to us at Ebonyi State University. And on behalf of all the students that you have been imparting for the past more than 3 decades ago, words are not enough to appreciate. But I leave you with this quote by William Arthur Ward. William Arthur Ward said that the mediocre teacher tells, the good teacher explains, the superior teacher demonstrates, but the great teacher inspires. You are the teacher who inspired me and made me who I am today. And for that, sir, I say thank you. Mr. Vice Chancellor, thank you. I am done.
Thank you, Prof. Okeke. It remains for me just to wrap up and to say thank you to everybody for being here. Your presence is much appreciated. Prof. Okeke, thank you for an inspirational talk. Thank you for showing us what the university is all about. It's about inspiration. It is about leadership. It's about being thoughtful. It's about being controversial. It's about unsettling conventional ways of thinking. That's why we're here. That's what we do. And these are important words to hang on to as we live in an age of eroding academic freedoms. We hold on to these kinds of truths. So thank you very much for what you have done and will continue to do. Everybody, there are refreshments outside, and we invite you all to join us. Thank you again. Have a good night.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the procession.